All right, welcome to another Hippocratic Adventures interview. I am Dr. Ashwini Bapat, and today we are very excited to have Dr. Susan Levenstein with us. She is the author of Dottoressa, an American Doctor in Rome. Dr. Susan Levenstein grew up in New York City, where she completed medical school and residency in internal medicine. In 1978, at the age of 30, she moved to Rome, where she has worked as a primary care doctor for the past 40 years. Her practice caters to the local Italian population, as well as the expat population, ambassadors, study abroad students, and foreign workers. Dr. Levenstein, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much for inviting me. I'm delighted to be here.
I absolutely loved reading your book, and we actually asked our members to submit questions. So we have quite a few, so we might as well get started.
Okay.
The first question, what made you want to move abroad and to Rome in particular?
It wasn't about moving abroad. It was about moving to Italy. Because when I was 20 or 21, I guess, I traveled, 22, I guess, I just turned 22. I traveled around Europe, and the place that I really fell in love with was Italy. And ever since then, I wanted to move back there. I wanted to try living there. I really loved it. And then in the end, some years later, I actually married an Italian man, which was slightly coincidental, but not completely. And so that made it a lot easier for me to do it. And I always wanted to.
And when you were transitioning to Italy and starting to get your paperwork together, and you shared this with your residency colleagues, were they surprised? What was their reaction at that time?
With my colleagues in the States, you mean?
Yeah.
Well, everybody knew that I loved Italy. It was the whole thing. I was going there every summer. I had married an Italian, and it wasn't a big surprise to anybody that we decided, my husband and I, my ex-husband, my first husband, and I decided to move back to his country, knowing what my attitude was toward it, and that he didn't mind going back to where he came from. So I don't think anybody was surprised.
Okay. And did you speak Italian prior to moving?
Yeah, when I first went to Europe, and therefore first went to Italy, I was 22 years old. It's easy to learn languages when you're 22 years old, a lot easier than when you're older. And also, I already spoke French, and French and Italian are very, very similar grammar and vocabulary. So it wasn't hard for me to pick up Italian when I traveled here. I spent 3 months in Italy during that trip. It was a grand tour, and I spent 3 months driving around Italy in my little VW.
That sounds lovely.
And so I learned Italian, and then when I met and then I would go back there, and I had Italian friends in New York who I would, people who I met in Italy or connected through Italy. And so I always spoke some Italian. And when I married my husband, at first we spoke English. He was living in the States, but then we sort of shifted into Italian even before we moved back to Italy.
Okay, that's
wonderful. And then of course I was in Italy, so I learned Italian very thoroughly. Yeah.
Wow. And how long did it take you to learn like medical Italian up to the, I guess, college or graduate level of Italian?
Medical Italian it's not as complicated as some things, because Italian has so much Latin in it, and there's so much Latin in medical English, or in all kinds of medical any language. Certainly it took a while before I got used to it. And of course, people speak about their bodies in very different ways and so on in Italy than they do in the United States. But I didn't really have a big problem with that, to be honest.
Okay, that's wonderful to hear. In Dottoressa, you describe your experience obtaining an Italian medical license, all the paperwork, the med school classes you took, redoing some clerkships in Rome, and then actually being initiated into oral exams. And it took you about 2 years to get all this
Mm,
paperwork in order, during which
mm,
time you were unable to practice medicine.
mm.
And you write in your book, and I quote you, it was harder to forfeit the professional identity I had painfully forged in 7 years of medical training. In Rome, I went from being a 100-hour-a-week doctor to being a tag-along in my husband's world. Back in the States, I'd have at least kept my dignity as a physician. Can you share with us what you felt during those 2 years when you were unable to practice medicine and how it affected your identity at that time?
That's a very interesting question.
Mm,
It was, I mean, on the one hand, there were a lot of advantages to it because the way that I filled up my time was by getting to know Rome. I more or less
mm,
memorized the guidebooks. I learned everything. I also got to know my mother-in-law and my family. I lived with them for 5 months. My family um, started to make a couple of friends, although not, that was slow and difficult. Um, I completely lost my identity.
mm,
It was, I think I may have said in the book that it was sort of like running at full speed and then smashing your head against a brick wall,
mm,
because you just lose everything. In Italy, not only did I not have a real professional identity, one, two, doctors were not particularly respected as they are in the States.
mm,
And so and three, nobody was interested. That was
mm,
another interesting Italian thing, which is that they consider it a little bit rude to ask what kind of work you do or
mm,
what your profession is. I mean, they're always very cautious in bugging people when they first meet them, so that I
mm.
could spend an entire evening with people without their ever finding out that I was a physician, that I was trained as a physician.
Wow.
Of course, I wasn't working as a physician.
Right.
So it was hard. And also, I had to learn these strange things to become, to learn about how you tell how long a body has been dead and things like that. I had to study
Right.
these things in Italian. That was hard. To read
Yeah.
technical Italian is hard. For me, reading technical Italian, reading scientific Italian, and doing math in Italian are three things that are very difficult for me
Yeah.
still now.
Yeah. I can only imagine. um, And so eventually in 1980, 2 years after you had arrived in Rome, you did open your first of actually 7 private practices that you have been part of over your career. At that time, it sounded like there was actually an oversupply of doctors compared to the Italian population. And there were many doctors that were underemployed or unemployed. And also, there was the phenomenon of doctor stealing, like where they stole patients from other doctors, which was really interesting to hear because that is not really a problem in the US where there are so many patients needing primary care doctors, for example. So when you first started out, when you first hung your first shingle, if I think that's the title of your first chapter, how did you attract your first patients?
It was not easy.
Yeah,
My first month, I saw one patient.
yeah.
That was the wife of a colleague of my husband's. My ex-husband is an engineer. And one of his colleagues' wives came to me, and she was my first patient. And she is still my patient 42 years,
Wow.
40 years later,
Yeah.
42 years, 41 years later, I guess it is. Um, and then the second month, it was 4 patients. The
Mm,
third month, it was 10 patients. And that was how it went. It was very, very slow. What I did was I dealt with everything in Rome that seemed to speak English,
mhm.
because I figured that that was where I was most likely to attract patients. And I wrote, I can't remember how many, but it must have been like, somewhere between 60 and 100 letters. And that means, at the time we didn't have computers, and it meant, typing everyone out and signing it and putting it in an envelope and mailing it. And I sent them to every English language school, every school that taught English, every English language embassy, anything that I could think of that was English language in Rome. And out of that, I got 0 patients.
Wow. Out of all of those letters, 0
That's right. Out
patients.
of all of those patients, I got 0 patients. What I ended up doing that did get me something was going in person to the American Embassy, which had a health unit, and I went to them and introduced myself, and they took me on at the beginning as a doctor, and I've sort of done that on and off for all of these years, is helping embassy personnel, and that actually did get me some patients. But it began, it was very, very slow, and it was word of mouth. If I got one patient, like I can't remember who my first monk was. There are a lot of Catholic religious in Rome,
Yeah.
obviously, and I had one, and he told all the other English, I got this huge number of people like that, for example. Or, later on there were all of the which there were not when I first came, but later on there were, I got a Filipina maid.
Yeah.
And she told all of the Filipino community. So I got all of these Filipino patients, and so on. And so because it was basically word of mouth.
Word of mouth.
Except for that one inn at the American Embassy where they did help me out.
And that was in person, so you had to.
And that was in person.
So that sounds like that was actually a lot of hard work to even get your private practice up and running and to get enough patients.
Sure. Yeah, it took me, after 6 months I was actually earning enough in the office to pay my rent for, I think it was 2 mornings a week or something like that.
Okay.
And that was how long that took.
Yeah.
But that was all. I wasn't earning anything extra. So we lived on my husband's salary, which was very small, for a long time, I think 2 years.
Wow. So it did take about 2 years to actually get the practice up and running to the point where you were able to make a salary.
Yep. And I tell people, when people come here from the States, I suspect that it's the same in other countries. I suggest strongly that they bring enough money to live off for 2 years, because it's so likely that it's going to take that amount of time before they get, the very few people who come here from the States, it's not something very many people do.
That's true. So you attended medical school in the 1970s, and you describe a particular moment during your med school interview at Mount Sinai, which you ended up going to. You had a male interviewer who, and I quote you again, admitted he felt uncomfortable talking to women. My posture and manner underwent a sex change that at the end he shook my hand, saying, "I'm shaking your hand just as though you were a man." Then, when you moved to Rome, you shared the experience of being in a clinic meeting and feeling overlooked, and taking comfort in the fact that, your colleagues didn't discriminate and single you out. They actually overlooked only you and another female in the room, your secretary. So what was it like to be an American female physician in Italy, and how has that experience hopefully changed over time?
Yeah. It's interesting because I am not sure, I actually am not convinced that I did worse in Italy than people do in the States. Of course, that experience with the guy who shook my hand just as though I were a man, that one is long gone, I'm sure. But I remember when I was in medical training, when I was doing my residency in the States, I remember, I can't remember if this got into the book, but I remember one guy walking into my office and walking right out again saying, "I ain't letting no lady doctor put her hands on me." So, it's not only in Italy. In Italy, at the beginning, I was told that I would never see Italian male patients. People said to me, an Italian man will never go to a woman doctor. And it turned out to be totally untrue. I do get more women patients than men, but that's true for everybody, especially if you do some gynecology. I do office gynecology as well as internal medicine. So I tend to see a lot more women. And also women go to the doctor a little bit more than men do. So most people who have a primary care practice see more women than men. But Italian men in general like to talk to women. Women are
That's
the people that they confide in. And this is something that gets found by study after study. And I have a feeling that that contributed to my not having too hard a time.
true.
If I had tried to get ahead in the hospital, I think I would have had if I had had a job in the
Mm,
public system, which I originally tried for, I might have had a harder time because women have a lot harder time getting promoted, becoming the
mm,
chiefs of departments, and so on. But I think actually that my American training sort of trumped, if I may
mm.
use the terrible word,
Sure.
trumped my being a woman generally, and the fact, that people were attracted to me as a female, especially if they were foreigners or if they were
Right.
married to foreigners, and that the fact that I was American made up for the disadvantage of my being a woman. But in any case, that's my feeling about it. I haven't, it's been so many years
Yeah.
since I had more patients than I could deal with
Yeah.
that I haven't thought about trying to get, it's
Yeah.
really by about, I don't know, 5 years after I moved here, I was overwhelmed with patients.
Wow.
So I never had to think about trying to get new ones,
Yes.
any that you see what I mean?
Yeah. And you also share stories about your experience with the Italian healthcare system, and in particular, some of the inconsistencies. You shared the story of an American tourist who you saw who had glazed over eyes and a headache, suspected of meningitis, and he went to the ER. And within 15 minutes, he had a spinal tap, he got antibiotics, saving his life. In another instance, you saw a nun who was similarly confused, who went to the hospital and unfortunately did not receive a workup despite your pleas. There was no spinal tap, no cultures, no antibiotics, and unfortunately, she did eventually die from what was probably meningitis. And so, how have you coped with the inconsistencies in medical care that your patients receive, particularly in emergency settings? Because just reading it in the book was so frustrating.
This is the bane of my life. It's the
Mm,
worst thing about my professional existence is not having a anybody in the United States or Germany or England or France or whatever can assume that if they send somebody to an emergency room that they'll more or less get decent care. It's not always true. I have actually, especially in recent years, heard more and more horror stories about American
mm,
emergency rooms. I had a member of my family nearly die
mm,
because of an important diagnosis being missed in one of the supposedly best emergency rooms
mm,
on the West Coast. Um, but the unevenness in Italy is far beyond that, and unfortunately, the unevenness goes from having great doctors who really know everything that they're doing and they're totally scrupulous, down to people who I would say know nothing. They're
mm,
like they're not doctors. They're like going to the barman on the corner, and you don't have. And the worst of it is the emergency rooms.
mm,
The hospitals, are more likely if a patient is hospitalized, they're more likely to be able to cope with them. But the emergency rooms can there's almost no training in emergency medicine. I mean,
mm,
they just started having training in emergency medicine, I think 10, 12 years ago, something like that.
right,
They instituted an emergency medicine residency, but it's considered a very undesirable thing to do. They get people who aren't
mm,
great in the first place going into it, and and they have a very hard time recruiting people to it, so that most of the emergency rooms are manned or
mhm.
staffed by people who are internists without a particular training in emergency
Right,
medicine, or by surgeons without a particular, or by anesthesiologists, people who are from intensive care units,
right.
so that there's this sort of mix.
So it sounds like emergency medicine as a specialty is pretty new. I know it's pretty new actually across the EU.
Yeah.
Um, and it sounds like perhaps there's a role to develop it more to make it
Unfortunately,
safer. It seems.
medical training,
Mm,
from in my book, I mean, there are two major problems with Italian medicine. One of them is that it's underfunded, which it's vastly underfunded. There are 1/3 as much per capita is
Mm,
spent on medical care here than it is in the United States. Of course, most of that money in the United States is, or much of it is wasted.
mm,
But in any case, it's vastly underfunded. And the other thing is that the training of physicians is still not at a European level, not at a world level.
mm,
And that extends to the training, to graduate training,
mm,
where people still say that they don't do, surgeons don't get to do enough operations. Um, in people who are being trained in primary care medicine don't get to put their hands on the patients at all. Things like this. So I suspect that the emergency room. I tried to look at that
yeah,
fairly recently, and I wasn't able to find too much because, in theory, everything is great. In theory,
yeah.
you look at the residences, and they come out being great. But I think that those two things are are really. I'm not sure which of them is worse.
Mhm.
I mean, probably, I have to emphasize, and I have to say this every time I'm asked a question about how lousy Italian medicine is, that Italians live on the average, it's probably increased now because of well, it may have changed now, but the last time that I saw it, it was between 4 and 5 years longer than
Yeah,
Americans,
yeah,
because they have a universal healthcare system that
yes.
extends to everybody, and because they have a healthy lifestyle. So they have
Mm,
two big points in their direction, and it works
yeah.
in terms of
That's
in terms of all of the outcomes that count.
Yeah, I think those are two huge advantages that I think Italy has that definitely helps. Um, you also shared stories of kickbacks between physicians and other physicians, pharmacists, and labs, which was very shocking to me. And you described similarly how medical students in the 1970s graduated without ever examining a patient, how graduates from medical school could be authorized to perform surgery without setting foot in an operating room. I hope that this has changed over the past 4 years, I mean, 4 decades. Um, Yet you share that you still cannot trust your colleagues, and you cannot trust that they are competent and skilled to a standard professional level. So how do you adapt to working in a system where you may not trust the medical expertise of colleagues you refer to?
Well, I'm very, very picky about who I
Mm,
refer to. I never refer to a random person. I always check them out first in some way. I get to know them and I stick with them. The same person
yeah,
has been doing my, you know, prostate ultrasounds for the last 35 years. The same person has been I've been using the same endocrinologist for 35 years.
yeah,
When one wonderful surgeon came back from training at Memorial Hospital in New York, about 25 years ago or something like that, I've never sent to another one.
mm,
I find somebody, I got to get to know them well,
yeah,
get to know their strengths and, any weaknesses that I might see, but I get to know them very well. So I know,
mm,
so that's it. I avoid sending to random specialists.
yeah. So, and you get to know the specialists over a period of time as well.
Yeah.
So many of your patients have actually visited your home, you have broken bread with them, and have become friends with others. This is pretty uncommon in the US, um, to become friends with patients or to take care of friends as patients. So, how do Italian practitioners view the physician patient relationship and boundaries in particular?
Okay, there are two sides to that. One is, how do the Italians view it? Italians have no boundaries. Italians,
Okay.
I have known surgeons to operate on their own mother for serious problems.
Okay.
Okay, so there's a real boundary problem there. But as far as I'm concerned, I have found um, much. I a lot of my friends are my patients. A lot of my friends come to me or have
Mm,
come to me as patients. And I have found that the disadvantages in terms of um, in terms of where my judgment might have problems and so on, um, I I usually feel that they're outweighed by the advantages of knowing that I more or less know what I'm doing.
Yeah.
The other side of that, which is my patients eating dinner at my house or something like that, that has actually almost never happened.
Okay.
Almost the only, I, I could almost say the only people that have ever come to my house who I met as patients have been musicians because I'm a serious amateur pianist,
Mhm.
and if I allow myself, if I meet a violinist, there's been a violinist, a cellist, a flutist, and I allow myself to approach them about getting together to make chamber music, and that's
That
really.
is awesome. I mean, that sounds like a very enriching experience.
I mean, I'm very, I try to be very careful about it. I mean, it's only been about 4 times in my career, I think,
Okay,
that
fair.
it's totally irresistible. And I actually, with one of those people, I did become fast friends in the end. We're
Yeah.
still friends. Violinist, we're still friends to this day.
Yeah, I mean, I think that reminds me of kind of the old family doctors that were the doctors. They were the only doctors in town. They made house calls 24/7, and they knew everyone in town. And that was part of their role, was that they knew everyone in town and they still had to take care of them.
Exactly. I mean, that for me is the ideal, the dream. I
Yeah,
think a lot of us have is that we would
yeah,
dream of
yeah,
practicing in that kind of a context where all of your, where you know all of your patients
yeah,
and really know them.
yeah,
And so that's why I don't, I've never considered it to be such an absolute thing of
yeah,
not treating your friends.
yeah. After 40 years in Rome, 41 years in Rome, what are your plans for the future?
Well, my plans for the future have changed enormously over the last year.
Yeah,
Because I very elaborately went to a lot of trouble to retire at the end of 2020. I said,
okay.
40 years is enough. That's it. And I did that. And it was I wrote thousands of emails out to try to get to every person who could conceivably ever want to see me again, that they would get to know this. And I explained it and I talked, this and that. And then I retired at the end of the year, and I spent the next 6 weeks staring at my computer screen. You can't go out to dinner. You can't see
Yeah,
friends. You can't travel. You can't, go out and volunteer and do things. This is a pandemic.
yeah,
So a COVID retirement turned out to not be the kind of retirement that I might have hoped to have. And at the end of 6 weeks, I threw in the sponge and went back to the office. So I started again in the office in the middle of February, and I only go in once a week. I go in once a week, and then I do a second session. I go in on Monday, and then on Thursday, I do a session of telemedicine. People who, for one reason or another. Yes, in fact, on Monday, I saw as many patients yesterday over Zoom and Skype as I did on Monday in my office.
well,
So yeah, and I'm sort of getting used to it. It's hard to manage because I have to bring the chart back, and if I don't have the chart, if they didn't have the appointment on that day, I use paper charts, by the way.
oh, wow. Okay.
I am privileged to be able to use paper charts. I'm glad I do. So that if a patient takes an appointment at the last minute for a online visit, my secretary will pull out the chart and scan the last page or whatever,
Yeah,
and send it to me by email,
yeah,
so that so that I remember what's going on with it.
yeah, yeah.
So we're working it out. We're figuring it out.
So you are working part-time. So retirement, you retired for 6 weeks and then you're working part-time. Did you have to email all 1,000 patients to let them know you're back?
To be honest, I decided in the end, I actually did write to about 100 or 120 or something like that
Mm.
of my most loyal
Yeah.
patients. Um, and I left, and then I left it to word of mouth. A lot of people
Yeah.
found out it's not supposed to be a
Yeah.
secret in any way, but I just couldn't go through the whole thing again. And
Yeah.
besides, I have the idea, I know that I'm going to stay, I'm going to keep doing this until the end of the pandemic. But
Mm.
I don't guarantee, I don't guarantee
Yeah.
that I'm going to be doing it after that. I may
Yeah.
decide to go back to my original plan and retire this fall or at the end of this year
Right.
when when it becomes possible to do things like traveling, which I
Yeah.
really, really would like to be doing.
Yeah. Where would you want to travel to, out of curiosity?
Ah, well, aside from the places that I would like to travel to where I will never be able to travel, such as Afghanistan
Sure.
and Yemen, which are two of my
Yeah.
dream places, I would very much like to go to Iran, where I know
Mm.
some people, and um, that 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 is one of my possible dreams. I'd like to go back to Turkey, where we have
Mm.
friends and places to go, and would love to be there. But the first thing that we would do would be to go to Indonesia,
Wow.
where we go to snorkel. We go
Oh.
to look at fish.
Oh, that sounds wonderful.
There's an area of eastern Indonesia that has maybe the best reefs in the world for
Wow.
snorkeling.
Oh, that's incredible. That sounds awesome.
Those are the things. But before that, I would fly to London. Two of my totally best friends live in
Yeah.
London. We would fly to Berlin. Berlin may be possible pretty soon because
Mm.
the EU, once ever, with a vaccination certificate,
Yeah.
you may be able to travel pretty soon within the EU.
Yeah.
But England is
Mm.
still a 2 week quarantine and so
Quarantine.
on.
Yeah.
So, go to Paris. I would like to visit Paris. I mean, you just start thinking. I think about this all the time. Where would we go
Yeah.
if we can actually travel?
Yeah, one of the reasons I also loved your book was because it allowed me, I've never been to Italy and I've never been to Rome, but through your descriptions of Rome, I was like, one of the first places we're going is Rome once COVID is over, because you just describe it in such a lovely way.
Oh,
Um,
thank you. I've
and
really never fallen out of love with Rome, with
yeah,
Italy.
yeah, you
Yeah.
know what? You can tell that you are in love with Rome still. It's there in your writing. Um, for a physician wanting to practice outside the US, do you have any advice? And, partly because we actually do have members that are interested in moving to Italy. Some of them have family connections in Italy. Some grew up in Italy, trained in the US, and are now trying to figure out how to come back
Mm,
to Italy. Um, any advice that you have for them?
mm. Aside from bring along enough money to live on for two
Yeah,
years or have a rich spouse, that's another possibility.
yeah.
Aside from that, I can really only speak to Italy. Obviously, I know a lot about Italy, and I know that somebody with American training is not transferable to Italy.
Yeah.
Period. And even if you have Italian citizenship through your parents or something like that, you still have to go, even now, you have to go through all of the rigmarole that I
Mm.
went through to get it recognized, unless there are some people find ways of getting their training recognized in other places
Mm.
in Europe.
That's right.
But now that I think of it, the only people I know who did that were actually did it in the UK.
Mm.
And
Exactly.
UK no longer is automatically recognized in Europe as it was until 3 months ago,
Yeah. Yeah.
until Brexit. Um, as far as advice about other things, yeah, I think that in all countries that you might go to, you have to realize that it's going to be very different practicing.
Mm.
I think that that's probably the most important thing.
Right.
It's going to be different depending on where you are. It'll
Right.
be different in Germany than it is in Italy. It'll be different in I don't know where, in Albania
Mm.
or whatever. But it will require a lot of understanding of the culture and so on. And most places that people would go, they're not going to have the luxury that I have of having an English-speaking patient population,
Right.
because
That's
there's
true.
always been a very large number of English speakers in Rome, because of either people who speak native English or people who speak good English,
Yeah.
or French, which I also speak, because of the embassies, because of the film industry, because of all the nannies and au pairs that come from England, because and so on and so forth. There are all sorts of sources of and the United Nations agencies.
Right.
The Food and Agricultural Organization of the UN is based in Italy. It's based in Rome. It's very close to me. The World Food Program, which I saw when they got their Nobel Peace Prize just a couple of months ago. Oddly enough, at least the articles that I read about it in American press didn't mention that it was based in Rome.
I would have never known that.
And it's based in Rome. And I have a lot of patients from the WFP.
Yeah.
And I thought that was too bad because
Yeah.
Rome deserves a plug. But in any case, so there's that, and there's that, and and there are a couple of other smaller UN agencies also.
Right.
But it's there's a large number. There's always been a lot of Americans, English,
Yeah.
and so on, and people who speak good English.
Good English. And my last question, was it all worth it with 40 years of looking back on your career, was it worth coming to Rome in Italy?
No question. Absolutely. It was worth it. I love living here. I think that the lifestyle is great. My second husband, who is in the other room, has lived here even longer than I have. He's been here for 50 years. And we're both completely, it would be hard for us to transfer anyplace else.
Yeah.
And even professionally, despite the drawbacks, for me, the privilege of being able to be a family doctor. I have people who, I have 4 generations in some families.
Wow. That's
Yeah.
incredible.
Yeah.
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 That is very rare.
And it's rare, and I suppose unless there aren't hardly any people doing that kind of medicine around. And for me, that's been a real joy. I haven't had to deal with the insurance companies,
which is huge.
I don't have to deal, and I don't have to deal with electronic medical records, which everybody I know hates. I think that my career, despite the difficulties with the limitations of Italian medicine and so on, I think that I've been happier with my career than almost anybody that I know in the States. I also had the best secretary in the world, the best office manager, who also happens to be my best friend, and having that good luck, because it was luck. She was hired by another office that I happened to go into. She wasn't hired by me, so it was pure luck, and it really made everything about my work a pleasure during these many years. Also, I've had the pleasure of working with a lot of excellent colleagues, partly because I put together the group that I'm in now. I assembled it from people who I knew and trusted, and so it's been good. It's been satisfying. The relations with the patients, have been is just wonderful. That I would say more than anything.
Yeah, I mean, reading your book, you could tell that you were still in love with your life in Rome, in Italy, and that you were enjoying what you were doing, and that you found it to be very fulfilling. And I suppose you took 6 weeks retirement, but you're back to part-time, so that's wonderful. So Dr. Levenstein, thank you so much for joining us. I really, really enjoyed reading your memoir, and I love chatting. You can find Dottoressa, an American doctor in Rome, on Amazon. And until next time, remember, together we can dream beyond borders.